The forest was silent in the most dangerous way possible. Not the peaceful silence of safety, but the kind that presses against your ears and tells you that death is nearby, waiting, breathing, listening, somewhere beyond the frozen tree line. Hundreds of German soldiers were moving into position. Rifles checked, machine guns loaded, orders whispered. They believed this would be easy. One broken American position, one exhausted defender, a matter of minutes. They were wrong. Because standing between them and total victory was one man, cold, wounded, nearly out of ammunition, yet unbroken. An American soldier who had already decided that if this position fell, the road behind him would drown in blood. And if holding this ground meant dying here, then so be it. He had made his choice long before the first shot of the coming battle would be fired. This is not the story of overwhelming firepower. This is not the story of superior numbers. This is the story of willpower, of a man who refused to retreat while surrounded by a force large enough to erase him from history. 4 days, 4 nights, no relief, no retreat, no surrender. And every hour the Germans attacked, they lost more men than they could explain. The position itself was nothing special on a map. A shattered farmhouse, a shallow trench line carved into frozen soil, a few ruined trees that once marked a boundary between farmland and forest. But in war, ordinary places become legendary when someone decides to make a final stand there. The American had been ordered to hold this line as long as possible. Military, language that everyone understands. As long as possible means until the ammunition runs low, until the radio goes silent, until the enemy breaks through, or until you are no longer alive to stop them. He checked his weapon again, fingers numb from the cold. His hands shook, not from fear, but from exhaustion. Sleep had become a memory. Food was almost gone. The radio crackled with distant, broken signals, units pulling back, lines collapsing, chaos spreading across the front. He was alone now. What the German battalion did not know was that this lone American had already studied the terrain in his mind. Every approach, every shadow, every narrow path where their numbers would mean nothing. He understood something they did not. A large force is weakest when it believes victory is guaranteed. The first attack came just before dawn. German scouts moved cautiously at first, expecting only light resistance. A few shots perhaps, a quick surrender. Instead, the forest exploded. Rifle fire tore through the mist. A machine gun opened up from a position they hadn't spotted. Men fell before they even understood where the shots were coming from. The Germans pulled back in confusion. Officers shouted. Orders overlapped. This wasn't supposed to happen. From his position, the American adjusted his fire calmly, methodically. Each bullet mattered. Each movement was calculated. He wasn't trying to stop all of them, just enough. Enough to make them hesitate. Enough to make them question. Enough to make them slow down. By mid-morning, the Germans attacked again, this time with more men mortar. Rounds slammed into the ground around him, throwing dirt and splinters into the air. One explosion lifted him off his feet and slammed him back down. Pain shot through his body. Blood soaked into his uniform. He dragged himself back into position, teeth clenched, refusing to scream. He keyed his radio and sent a short message. Enemy attacking in strength, still holding. No drama, no panic, just facts. As the day wore on, the battlefield became a graveyard of failed assumptions. The Germans could not understand how one position was still firing back. Every assault met resistance. Every attempt to flank was anticipated. Every push forward cost the men they couldn't afford to lose. Night fell, bringing no relief. The cold crept into his bones. The sounds of the forest changed. Boots crunching softly on frost. Whispered German voices. The metallic click of weapons being readied. He stayed awake through sheer force of will, knowing that sleep, even for seconds, meant death. At one point, a German voice called out in broken English, offering surrender terms. He did not respond. Instead, he waited until movement betrayed their position and fired. By the second day, the Germans were no longer confident. They were angry. Artillery pounded the area. The farmhouse collapsed into rubble. Trees snapped like matchsticks. Smoke choked the air. The American was wounded again, shrapnel tearing into his leg. He tied it off with a strip of cloth and kept firing. His radio transmissions grew shorter. Still holding. Low ammo. Enemy massing again. Command knew what that meant. Relief was not coming. Other units were fighting for their lives. Retreat routes had to be protected. This one man, this impossible stand, was buying time for hundreds of others to escape. By the third night, hallucinations set in. Faces in the smoke, voices calling his name. He fought through it, anchoring himself to simple actions. Reload, aim, fire. Reload, aim, fire. The Germans tried one last tactic, overwhelming force. They came in waves, and still the position did not fall. By the time dawn broke on the fourth day, the battlefield was eerily quiet. The German battalion had stalled. Too many casualties, too much resistance from a place that should have been silent days ago. And in the ruins of that position, an American soldier remained alive, wounded, barely conscious, but victorious in the only way that mattered. He had held, not because he was invincible, not because he was fearless, but because he refused to quit. And this was only the beginning of what the world would later struggle to believe. The silence after the fourth dawn did not mean peace. It meant calculation. Somewhere beyond the smoke and broken trees, German officers stood over maps stained with mud and blood, trying to understand how an entire battalion had been delayed, humiliated, and bled by what should have been a shattered remnant of an American line. Reports conflicted. Some claimed a full platoon was hidden in the forest. Others swore they had seen multiple machine gun nests firing from different angles. No one wanted to admit the truth forming quietly in the back of their minds, that they were being held back by a single man who refused to die. Inside the ruined position, the American barely registered the passage of time. His world had narrowed to pain, cold and sound. The weight of his weapon felt heavier than it should have, not because the steel had changed, but because his body was failing inch by inch. His leg burned constantly now, every movement sending sharp warnings through his nerves. Yet he continued to shift positions whenever the enemy fire probed too closely. He understood that predictability would kill him faster than bullets. So he became unpredictable, firing from places that should have been impossible, appearing silent for hours and then erupting with sudden, accurate violence that convinced the Germans reinforcements had arrived. The enemy tried patience next. Snipers watched the ruins through scopes, waiting for the smallest sign of movement. He learned to stay still for unnatural lengths of time, breathing shallowly, ignoring cramps, letting frost bite into exposed skin. War had stripped away comfort long ago. Now it stripped away humanity itself. He was no longer a soldier in the conventional sense. He was an obstacle, a living delay tactic carved into the earth. Every hour he survived meant another American unit slipping away. Another bridge blown, another line reformed deeper behind him. On the afternoon of the second day after the initial assault, German infantry attempted infiltration rather than attack. Small groups moved cautiously through the woods, stepping over their own dead, whispering signals to one another. The American detected them not by sight, but by rhythm, the unnatural pauses in birdsong, the subtle crunch of boots where snow should have been untouched. When they were close enough to believe they were unseen, he struck with sudden brutality, firing into the densest movement, then shifting position immediately. Confusion spread faster than fear. Orders were shouted. Men dropped to the ground, firing wildly into trees that no longer held their enemy. His ammunition was now dangerously low. Each reload felt heavier than the last, not because of fatigue alone, but because he knew each magazine emptied brought him closer to silence. He conserved rounds with ruthless discipline, firing only when the chance of stopping the enemy justified the cost. Grenades were used sparingly, saved for moments when German troops clustered too tightly, confident that numbers would protect them. They never did. The radio crackled once more that evening. Static swallowed most of the transmission, but one message came through clearly enough to understand its meaning. The larger American force had successfully withdrawn. The delay had worked. His mission, though never officially stated, had been completed. He was ordered to fall back if possible. The word "if" lingered in the air long after the signal died. He did not move. Withdrawal now meant crossing open ground under enemy observation. Wounded, exhausted, and nearly empty-handed, retreat would likely end with capture or death before he made it 50 yards. So he chose the only option that still made sense. He stayed, forcing the enemy to remain cautious, forcing them to believe the position was still fully manned. In war, perception could be as lethal as artillery. That night, the Germans attempted psychological pressure. Loudspeakers called out again, promising medical care, food, survival. The American listened in silence, not because he was tempted, but because he was too tired to feel anything at all. Surrender required energy. Resistance at this point was instinct. He responded not with words, but with a single rifle shot that shattered the speaker's casing and echoed through the trees. The message was clear. By the third full day, the German battalion was no longer advancing. They were pinned by doubt. Every attempt to move forward was met with resistance that seemed to come from nowhere. Their officers faced an impossible choice: commit even more men to a position that should not matter, or bypass it and risk attack from the rear. Pride and fear argued against each other. Pride lost men. Fear lost time. Inside the ruins, the American's strength ebbed dangerously. Dehydration blurred his vision. His hands trembled uncontrollably now. At one point, he dropped his weapon and had to crawl forward to retrieve it, dragging himself through mud and debris like something less than human. But when German movement appeared again at the tree line, his training overrode his weakness. Muscle memory took control where conscious thought failed. He fired, adjusted, fired again, becoming once more the immovable presence the enemy had learned to respect. When the final German assault was prepared, it was meant to be decisive. Artillery softened the area until nothing recognizable remained. Infantry advanced cautiously, expecting no survivors. When firing erupted again from the wreckage, disbelief turned into fury. Some German soldiers refused to advance further, convinced the position was cursed or trapped. Others pressed forward out of anger, only to be cut down by fire that should not have existed. By the end of the fourth day, the German battalion had achieved nothing measurable, no ground gained, no breakthrough secured, only losses that could not be justified. Orders finally came down to disengage and move around the position. The delay had cost them their momentum. Elsewhere along the front, opportunities were lost forever. And in the shattered remains of that forgotten patch of land, an American soldier lay barely conscious, surrounded by empty magazines, blood-soaked bandages, and the evidence of a stand that history would struggle to explain. He had not defeated them in the traditional sense. He had simply refused to be removed when the firing finally stopped. It did not stop all at once. It faded unevenly, like a storm moving away but never fully disappearing. Distant artillery rumbled somewhere far off, a reminder that the war had not ended, only shifted its attention elsewhere. For the American, the silence felt unreal. His body no longer responded the way it should have. Pain had dulled into something heavier, deeper, a pressure that made breathing feel optional. He tried to sit up and failed. The world tilted, then steadied, then blurred again. Time became meaningless. He drifted in and out of awareness, unsure whether minutes or hours were passing. Snow began to fall lightly, settling on the wreckage around him, softening the violence of the scene. It dusted broken weapons, dark stains in the ground, the twisted remains of trees that had absorbed more bullets than leaves in their lifetime. Somewhere nearby, German voices moved cautiously, no longer aggressive, but careful, men stepping into a place they had learned to fear. They approached expecting traps, expecting gunfire, expecting resistance. They found none. The American lay motionless, his weapon still in his hands, finger resting near the trigger out of habit rather than intent. His uniform was stiff with dried blood and frozen mud. His face was gaunt, eyes half open but unfocused. Even now, even unconscious, his presence seemed to command caution. A German soldier nudged his rifle away with the tip of his boot and stepped back quickly, half expecting the man to suddenly rise and fire again. He didn't. Medics were called forward, not out of kindness but curiosity. Officers gathered, studying the position with growing disbelief. There were no signs of the platoon they had imagined. No reserve trenches, no supporting units. Just one fighting position, reused again and again, and the empty shells that told the story more clearly than words ever could. One officer quietly counted magazines. Another traced the firing angles with his eyes. Slowly, the truth settled in. This had been one man. They carried him away on a stretcher, not as a prisoner but as an anomaly, something the war had produced that didn't fit into reports or doctrine. He was still alive, barely, his pulse weak but present, his body hanging on through stubborn refusal rather than strength. Somewhere along the evacuation route, he regained consciousness briefly, eyes opening just enough to register unfamiliar uniforms and foreign voices. He did not struggle. He had nothing left to give. When American forces later retook the area, they found what remained of the stand. Officers walked the ground in silence, reconstructing the fight in their minds. They measured distances, counted shell casings, noted the craters and shattered cover. No one spoke for a long time. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound inadequate. Reports traveled up the chain of command, growing more careful with every retelling. Numbers were checked, dates verified. German unit logs captured later would confirm it. An entire battalion delayed, held in place and forced to reroute because one position simply would not fall. Because one man decided that retreat was not an option available to him. The American survived his wounds. Recovery was slow, painful, often lonely. He did not speak much about what had happened, not because he was hiding anything, but because the words felt too small. How do you explain 4 days that collapse into instinct? How do you describe fear when it becomes routine? When survival is reduced to repetition and stubbornness? When recognition finally came, it came quietly. No speeches matched the scale of what he had done. No ceremony could recreate the cold, the isolation, the certainty that help was not coming. Medals could acknowledge bravery, but they could not capture endurance, the kind that doesn't shine, that doesn't look heroic in the moment, that simply refuses to break among soldiers. His story spread differently, not as a legend polished for headlines, but as a reminder passed in low voices. A reminder that the battlefield does not always belong to the strongest force, or the largest army, or the most advanced weapons. Sometimes it belongs to the person who stays when leaving would be easier, the one who holds when logic says the position is already lost. Long after the war moved on, after maps were redrawn and battles renamed, that patch of ground remained ordinary again. Trees grew back. Snow fell without interruption. No monument marked the place where a battalion had been stopped cold. Only those who knew the story understood what had happened there. One man had stood in the way, and the war, for 4 days, had gone no further. History often remembers wars in numbers. Divisions moved, cities captured, casualties counted, lines drawn and erased on maps by hands far from the gunfire. But sometimes, history pauses, forced to slow down by something it cannot easily measure. Not an army, not a weapon, just a human decision. Somewhere in the chaos of that winter battlefield, the war ran into a wall it did not expect. Not concrete, not steel, but will. One American soldier, exhausted beyond reason, wounded beyond safety, isolated beyond hope, made a choice that no order could demand and no training could guarantee. He chose to stay, and by staying, he changed the shape of the battle around him. He did not win by advancing. He won by refusing to move. For 4 days, an entire German battalion planned, attacked, adjusted, and failed. They brought numbers. They brought firepower. They brought certainty. And all of it broke against one position that would not go quiet. Every hour they were delayed rippled outward. Units escaped. Lines stabilized. Lives were spared that would never know his name. That is the cruel irony of such stands. The people saved rarely learn who paid the price. He never set out to become a legend. In the moment, there was no thought of medals, stories, or remembrance. There was only the next reload, the next movement, the next breath. Courage, stripped of romance, looks a lot like endurance. It looks like continuing when fear has already done its worst. It looks like holding a line long after logic says it no longer matters. And yet it mattered. Long after the gunfire faded, after uniforms were folded away and weapons turned silent, the meaning of that stand endured. It lived not in headlines, but in the quiet understanding among soldiers that sometimes survival depends on someone else's refusal to quit, that sometimes the difference between collapse and escape is measured in hours bought by a single stubborn soul. This is why stories like this endure, because they remind us that history is not only shaped by generals and strategies, but by individuals who decide alone, unseen, that they will not be the point where everything breaks. That even when surrounded, exhausted and forgotten, one person can still force the world to slow down. For 4 days, an entire battalion learned that lesson the hard way. And somewhere in the silence that followed, the war moved on, changed, delayed, and quietly humbled by one man who simply refused to step aside.